Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about, first published in 1927 in the Nashes and Pall Mall magazine. A young man spoiled from birth tries to break away from his mother's grasp for love and become a man. Finding a reluctant friend's help, he must face himself or lose all. The Indomitable Mrs. Garthorne. It was one of those still bright days in early February, on which the warmth of the southern sun charms one with the illusion that spring is already come hot-foot across the Spanish border, and I, who prefer illusion to fact, was watching the play of the swell that rolled in now and again from the Atlantic, when I was so unexpectedly summoned to play my small part in a drama that was to affect 4 lives so profoundly, to say nothing of my own. The introduction was commonplace enough. I had arrived in Biarritz the previous afternoon only, and although I knew perhaps a score of the English and American visitors who were spending the season there, I was not aware that young Hugh Garthorne and his mother were among the number until he suddenly invaded my high retreat on the island rock, near the complicated little harbour of the fishermen. I heard the sound of someone mounting with an evident hesitation the twisting flight of steps that gives access to the little railed plateau on the summit of the rock, and turned my head to see Hugh slowly coming into view, rather as if, even then the metaphor occurred to me, he were rising to join me on the stage by means of a badly worked trap. I can't pretend that I was glad to see him. Apart from the fact that I was in a mood to dream rather than to talk, I was not greatly drawn to young Garthorne. He was spoilt by his mother, who, though she certainly spoilt no one else, permitted, even encouraged, this only child of hers to lounge through life with no occupation save that afforded by playing games and dressing himself. Judging from his appearance, he must have spent a considerable time every day undressing himself. A great pity, I thought, for he was a handsome, intelligent-looking youngster. He gave no sign of surprise at seeing me alone there. "Hello, Edwards," he said casually. "And hello, Garthorne," I replied, adding, as he came and sat down beside me, "the inevitable, I didn't know that you were in Biarritz." "Been here for 5 weeks," he said. "Oh, have you?" I returned, mentally cursing the necessity for politeness. Why should I sit here exchanging inanities with the spoiled child of a rich widow whom I disliked, when I might be indulging my fancy with enticing dreams? It was so good, so stimulating, to be back again by the open sea, to be able to watch on this day of calm sunshine the occasional roller coming from across the world, heave magnificently against the rocks in front of us, split, break into foam, and then in sudden petulance dash at the base of the island, hissing and chattering. "Do all the big things in life get broken up like that?" Hugh remarked unexpectedly, glancing at me with a faint blush. I was startled. I had been anticipating some gossip of the last tennis tournament, or of where the best jazz band was to be found for the dansant, some fritter of that kind. But now that I looked at him more closely, I thought I could see signs of a new seriousness in his face. "The wave at least dies in splendor," I said. "There's that, of course," he replied, watching the sea and slightly shrugging his shoulders before he continued, after a moment's pause, "T saw you come up here. I followed you on purpose. You see, you're different from the other people in our set, being a poet and so on. I got a feeling you might understand." That speech warmed me towards him. I was flattered by his description of me, even with the doubtful qualification of his "and so on," for, indeed, I am not known to the world at large as a poet. "Understand what?" I asked gently. "I have said that the introduction to my drama was commonplace enough, and I saw no probability of its ever developing on other than purely conventional lines when, with the freedom from self-consciousness that came in his case from being the petted and adored son of his rich mother, he confessed to having fallen in love with a young violinist who played at the casino. The whole thing was, it seemed to me, so trite, so hackneyed, so precisely what one might have anticipated. "What does your mother say?" I asked. "She has always given you everything you wanted, won't she give you this?" "I haven't dared to say anything to her about it," he said. I raised my eyebrows. "But I thought," I began. She wants me to marry Lady Rose Whitley, he interrupted me. Some people imagine that we're engaged already. She'll be my partner in the mixed doubles next week. Hike her, too. Nice kid. But it isn't only that. You don't know my mother well, do you? I did not. I had never wished to. I had always heard her spoken of as a hard, self-seeking, intolerant woman, and that report of her had been confirmed by my own observations. She was, I believed, a woman with but one weakness, the boy to whom I was now speaking. No, I don't know her at all well, I admitted. Then the thing you don't know about her, he explained, is that she's a bit crazy on this subject. I don't know why. She's sensible enough about everything else. But the only real row we've ever had was about something of this sort, when I was at Balliol. I was a young ass, of course, and I saw afterwards that she'd been perfectly right on that occasion. But, well, she gave me a sort of scare. First time she'd ever gone on at me like that, you know, told me then that if ever I married without her consent she'd disown me, you understand. He paused and grinned at me cheerfully as he concluded, and considering that I haven't got a bean of my own and no profession that might be dashed awkward. It certainly might, I agreed. His frank confession, however trite, had warmed my heart towards him. You don't mind my telling you all this? He half apologized. Fact is, I wondered if you'd feel like helping me. Helping you? I temporized, my mind suddenly full of romantic cinematographic pictures of waiting motorcars, frenzied escapes, and sentimental reconciliations, with myself, modestly in the background, performing some unobtrusive miracle. I wondered if you'd talk to my mother about it, he said. But no, that was more than I felt prepared to do. Mrs. Garthorne was the kind of woman that I have always been afraid of, tall, handsome, commanding, with a kind of solidity, both of the flesh and the mental outlook, that greatly intimidates me. I would have been ready to commit some not too desperate offense against the law in order to help Hugh, but I could not face his mother on such an errand. My dear chap, what would be the use of that? I said. I shouldn't have the least influence with her. Tell you what, he replied, come and see her this afternoon. She's playing at the casino. Your mother's playing? I stammered. Good Lord. He ejaculated with another grin. My hat. No. Come and see her. It was probably relief at the relative simplicity of this so suddenly substituted alternative that made me agree to his proposal without demur. But even as I did so, I had an uneasy feeling that I was letting myself in for something that I should do much better to avoid. This new Hugh Garthorne whom I saw for the first time on the little island rock at Biarritz was, I felt, going to be uncommonly difficult to influence. He had the look of a man who has definitely made up his mind. He had something of his mother's air of resolution. Though I don't quite understand why you should imagine that I can help you, I added feebly. Well, you know all about psychology and that sort of thing, was the only explanation I had from him. When I saw the name of the girl on the program, the feeling that this affair of Hugh's was, after all, essentially commonplace and uninteresting returned to me with new force. The name given was Paula Gonzalez, an obvious and clumsy pseudonym, I decided, and was instantly prepared for a figure to match it, a young woman with a striking profile, handsome, common and loud. Hugh, sitting beside me, nudged my elbow. That's her father, he whispered. Just come into the orchestra. With the violin. The chap with white hair. The man he indicated was still standing with, as it seemed to me, an effect of hesitation. Despite the absolute whiteness of his thick hair, his eyebrows were dark and his moustache and neat pointed beard only slightly tinged with grey. I guessed him to be still on the sunny side of 60. As I watched him, he shot one quick glance at Hugh, and then sat down, turning his back on us. He knows about you, then? I murmured to Hugh. He has probably guessed, he returned. Is he likely to be difficult? I asked. Can't say yet, was the answer. You see, I've never spoken to either of them. But how could he guess in that case? I protested. Spotted me, I expect, Hugh said. I'm always here when she plays. Besides which I generally wait about to see them come out. With that, although there may appear to have been little cause for my change of attitude, the sense of being drawn into a hackneyed, common intrigue definitely left me. It may have been due to this evidence of restraint on Hugh's part, or it may have been the effect that the glimpse of the white-haired first violin had had upon me. I could not understand that look he had thrown at Hugh. reflecting on the man's hesitation, the way in which he had stood with a half-abstracted, half-attentive air before he had, as it were, dared that one brief glance. It came to me that the action had been timorously planned. I wondered if the man were one of those reserved, self-conscious people who never outgrow a childish dread of appearing conspicuous. I was certainly becoming intrigued by Hugh's love affair even before I saw the object of his adoration. She was below the average height and looked smaller, perched up alone there on the platform, a rather pathetic childish figure, with a child's mouth, set, at the moment, in a mold of intent determination that did not break into a smile when she bowed to her audience. She was undoubtedly pretty, but I hardly remarked that, being drawn from the first moment by her air of intelligence, combined with that effect of girlish seriousness, as if she would attack and conquer her world by sheer endeavor. She was dark enough to carry off her Spanish name, but she was not a Spanish type. She was altogether too reserved and too tender. I admired her at once, and when she played I fell in love with her in my paternal, middle-aged way, deep enough to feel that the Hugh Garthorne I had known was not worthy of her. She looked so sweet and yet so vital as she played to us, so eager and so intent to give us her very best. But though her best was very good for a child of 19, full of fire and feeling, I knew that she would never make a first-class violinist. She had worked hard, I guessed, but she was not a born musician. Of course, all her pieces were encored. There was not a man in the audience, and only a few women, who would not have rewarded her so evident wish to please them. As she came to the end of her last encore, I became aware that Hugh was trembling as if he were shaking with cold, an impossible contingency in that overheated concert room. I turned towards him, wondering if he had been deeply stirred by the music, and saw that his eyes were fixed upon that delightful child on the stage with a gaze that expressed at once anticipation and the keenest anxiety, the look of a man who expects some greatly longed-for sign, but is tremulously afraid that it may be denied him. A little startled, I turned my attention back to Paula Gonzalez. She had finished playing and was bowing her acknowledgments of the enthusiastic applause, smiling gratefully as if she loved us all for our kindness to her. And then, just as the white-haired man in the orchestra had done, and with the same effect of nervous resolution, she gave one quick but unmistakable glance at Hugh before she made her exit. She did not smile as she did it. It seemed rather as if she were conscious of taking a liberty. "You were expecting her to look at you," I said to him as soon as we were outside. "She did it yesterday," he admitted. "But you've never attempted to speak to her or her father," I commented. "Look here, Edwards," he exclaimed, taking me by the arm. "I've told you about this because you're the only chap I know who I thought might understand. Anyway, I don't know anyone else who'd be likely to. I couldn't say much to you this morning, but now you've seen her it's different. Surely you understand now?" I did, up to a point. I was beginning to understand, for instance, that the Hugh Garthorne I had known hitherto was not the real man, and that I had a distinct feeling of liking for the new one who was now being revealed to me. "I can quite understand your being in love with her," I said. "She's adorable." He gave a little sigh, perhaps at the hopelessness of expressing her quality in mere language, before he replied, "Well, then, don't you see how impossible it would be to try and scrape up an acquaintance in the usual way, the usual caddish way? I couldn't. She's well, you've seen her now, so you ought to know. That's why I want you to come and talk to my mother. I want her to invite them to our house. It's the only way I've been able to think of getting to know them decently." We had come down to the plage and he was facing the wind that was coming up fitfully out of the great distances of the open Atlantic, and already tossing the crests of the increasing rollers into a spume of white spray. There was, I thought, something almost heroic in the calm certainty of his expression just then. "We are going to have a storm," I said. "The sooner the better," he replied unexpectedly. "But, look here, will you try first if you can do anything with my mother?" "I'll try," I said. I could not deny him that, though I knew it was hopeless. "And if I don't succeed?" I added. "She'll have to disown me," he returned quietly. "I expect I'll be able to earn a living somehow. And, anyway, it would prove what I was willing to do for her." And that was how I came to have an interview with that terrible, intimidating woman, his mother. I went the next afternoon while Hugh was at the casino. Mrs. Garthorne received me politely enough. There was no reason why she should not do so. She had nothing against me, but the consciousness of my mission made me feel more uncomfortable than usual in her presence. She was so essentially a woman rangy. She had long since finally made up her mind on every conceivable question of society, politics and religion. She would not have taken the advice of an archbishop if it had not suited her own views, and what chance had I when I proposed to attack what I had gathered to be the most cherished of all her fixed opinions? The apparent effect of my foolish embassy was not, however, quite what I had anticipated. I began, tactfully, by talking of Hugh, a subject to which she was always attentive, and presently ventured the suggestion that his character had developed considerably since we had last met. She was pouring out the tea, and paused at that with the teapot still poised in her hand. "You find him more serious?" she asked shrewdly. "I do, yes, and more." I twiddled my fingers, searching for a word. "More thoughtful," I concluded weakly. She put down the teapot and passed me my cup, holding my gaze the while with a resolute stare that made me tremble. "You know that he's in love?" she asked. I had forgotten about Rose Whitley, and thought that she had already got wind of the affair and that the game was up. The fact gave me courage. "Most beautifully, even heroically in love," I said. "It will be the making of him." "Ah," she commented quietly. I had never seen her look more solid. "He's inspired," I continued, "and, I feel, worthily." "You've seen her?" she put in. "Yesterday afternoon, at the Casino de la Plage," I admitted. "Ah," she commented again with that effect of immense resolution. "And her name?" I hesitated. I was ashamed of the poor little tinsel name, so suggestive of yellow skirts, black lace and castanets that suited so ill that earnest child with the violin. "Paula Gonzalez," I said. "I'm greatly obliged to you, Mr. Edwards," she returned, and immediately began to talk not about Hugh or his entanglement, but about Biarritz society and its doings, a steady stream of hard, fluent conversation that gave me no chance to do more than interpolate a brief monosyllable. She talked me out of my chair and out of the house. I do not believe that anything short of physical violence would have stopped her. And though she said nothing impolite, I received very clearly the impression that I need not call on her again. I met Hugh by appointment at the Miramont. It was a day of rain and blustering wind and the plage was impossible. "So you've done it?" he remarked as I sat down by him. I explained that what I had done was to give him away and nothing more. "Good," he replied, surprisingly, I thought. "But, my dear chap," I began. "That's all right," he interrupted me. "It's exactly what I wanted. Cursed odd, I admit, but you know, I just hadn't got the courage to break it to her. That was where I stuck, somehow. I've given her a hint or two, but she pretended not to notice. Now she knows, I don't care a damn. No end obliged to you, old top." "But what are you going to do?" I asked. "Split," he said quietly. "Make a clean breakaway." What else could I do? I felt bound to remonstrate with him. "That's all very well, my dear old chap," I said, "but you owe a lot to your mother. She may be a bit queer on this subject of your marriage, but she's utterly devoted to you, given you everything you asked for, simply lived for you. Even if she were not your mother, common gratitude, I mean." "What?" He was more impressed by that than I had expected. "Yes, you're right," he admitted. "Besides, how are you going to live?" I concluded for him. "Oh, it isn't that," he replied contemptuously. "I'd make a living somehow. Scene shifting or something. I've faced that idea. That's nothing. What I was going to say was that it was just funking to run away. Paula's so tremendously worth winning, isn't she? Worth the very greatest thing I could possibly do." "Which is?" I inquired, puzzled. "Face it out," he said. "Make my mother give in. Go on living with her, and back my will against hers." "By heaven," I exclaimed. "That would be magnificent." "I'll do it," he announced, and for a moment he looked capable of anything. Then he frowned, sighed and slightly pushed his chair away from the table. "Only," he said, "you must come back with me, just to start with. I know it looks like weakness, but, you see, I've got to snap the chain, if you know what I mean. My mother has dominated me all these years, and I've got the habit of giving in to her. But if I could once break that habit, I could go on. I'm perfectly certain I could go on. And if you're there, I should have to do it." I felt at the moment as if I would sooner parade Biarritz in pajamas than face Mrs. Garthorne again so soon, but I understood exactly how he felt about the great preliminary effort needed to snap the Chang of habit and agreed to lend him my support, assuming, I hope, such an appearance of careless courage as would be most likely to stiffen his own. Very well. Come on, I said, getting to my feet. We'll go at once. So far as I was concerned, that, I knew, was the only chance. I should never do it if I had time to think. Mrs. Garthorne was in the same room and the same chair in which I had left her barely an hour earlier. She turned her head when we came in, but gave us no other greeting. She was fully prepared for what we had to say and was perfectly confident of utterly routing us, but, like the great general that she was, she took no risks, her first piece of strategy being to lay all the burden of the attack upon us. She intended to give no sign until we had revealed our tactics and discovered our artillery, such as it was. I looked at Hugh and realized that it was for me to open the battle. He was gazing abstractedly out of the window, apparently lost in some mental calculation, but whether he was already funking the engagement or not, I couldn't guess. In any case, I had to offer myself up as a forlorn hope to tempt the enemy out of cover. I did not, I confess, display either great courage or remarkable intelligence in my opening, but I have an incurable habit of politeness. If Hugh's life, instead of only his happiness, had depended upon the issue, I do not think I could have been rude to Mrs. Garthorne at that moment. I must apologize for returning so soon, I said. But I met Hugh in the town and, realizing what a very poor hand I had made of my ambassadorship earlier, I felt that I must ask you to let me tell you what I really had no opportunity of telling you this afternoon. I could have gone on from that if she had permitted me, worked myself up, perhaps, into an appeal by the practice of my own eloquence, but she cut me short. The sound she made is usually written for, but nothing can express the insolence and contempt she put into it. I was utterly rejected and dismissed. Never in my life have I felt so abominably insulted. Nevertheless, it seemed that I had served some purpose in thus drawing the enemy's guns, if the forlorn hope itself had been completely annihilated by that single discharge. Hugh had had time to find his method, time enough to screw up his courage to the sticking point. After all, what he had chiefly required of me was my witness. I came to tell you that I'm going to marry Miss Paula Gonzalez, mother, if she'll have me, he said, still with his gaze on some ultra-terrestrial vision, possibly the imagined features of his ideal. Mrs. Garthorne remained perfectly still, perfectly contemptuous. A faint snort was her only audible reply. And, Hugh continued with a faint smile, and with your full consent. That seemed to be a good shot. He had, at least, succeeded in surprising her. She looked at him sharply, as if it had crossed her mind that he might possibly have some card up his sleeve. Indeed, I thought I caught a hint of something in her expression that looked rather like alarm. Hugh. She apostrophized him sharply. Don't be absurd. I mean to get my own way this time, you see, he said. Her fear, if I had been correct in my diagnosis, was evidently relieved by his answer. She got to her feet, looking bigger and more impressive than ever in her cold wrath. You'd better go to your room, Hugh, she pronounced majestically. And never let me hear another word from you on this subject. It was the method of the autocrat, of the governess with the small child, by which she had always ruled him. In reverting to it she played on his familiar reactions, re-stimulated the sensations of the helpless boy who had always been dependent upon her. And I knew that if Hugh submitted now he would be beaten. It was here that he had either to snap the chain of habit which had bound him for more than 20 years or submit forever to his mother's imperious will. I looked at him, expecting to see the signs of the coming defeat, a bent head, a nervous movement of the hands, but his head was raised, his hands were loosely clasped behind his back and he was smiling. In future you will hear from me on this subject, mother, whenever we meet, he said steadily. I shall talk of nothing else. She looked straight into his eyes and he returned her gaze with equal steadiness. I left them there still locked in that grip. I had played my part. Hugh had taken his line, the only right line, I believed, and no one could help him now. But what the end of it would be I could not guess. Somehow I could not imagine Mrs. Garthorne giving in. I did not see Hugh again for 3 days, and then we met, by accident, on the plage about 4 o'clock. He took me by the arm. Good, I wanted to see you, he said. There's something I want you to do for me. I shuddered with a horrible premonition that I was to be called upon for yet another interview with his mother. A dozen excuses rose to my mind, but there was a new force and resolution about Hugh's voice and manner that checked them from finding utterance. "Oh. What's that?" I asked. "I want you to make the acquaintance of Mr. Gonzalez and Paula," he said. "I can't yet. I've told her that I won't see them again until I've got her consent to bring them to the house. But I should like you to get in touch with them. You can't give them any messages from me, of course, but you might sort of interest them in me, what?" I agreed almost with enthusiasm, so relieved was I. "And how goes the battle royal?" I asked. "Pretty stiff," he said. "But I'm getting into training. I started with an infernal handicap, you know, but I'm picking up now. All this'll be splendid practice in keeping a stiff upper lip and that sort of thing if it comes to the scene shifting after all." Who would ever have thought that the boy had such fine stuff in him, I reflected, as I waited by the artist's entrance to the casino. I felt a sudden warm confidence in him, not in his chances of winning that fearful contest of wills with his mother. I believed her to be indomitable, but in the certainty that he would eventually make good. I could help him to a better start in life than a job as a scene shifter would give him, and I was fully prepared to do it. Not alone for the sake of Hugh and that appealing little violinist, although they came first. No, let me be honest and admit that Mrs. Garthorne's contemptuous still rankled in my mind. I could never forgive her for that. I found no difficulty in making the acquaintance of Gonzalez and Paula. Indeed, they seemed to be expecting me. More than that, when they had accepted my invitation to tea and we had settled ourselves into a corner of the inner room at the Miramont, they made it very easy for me to introduce the subject I had been charged to interest them in. At the first casual mention of a young friend of mine who had greatly admired Miss Gonzalez playing, they exchanged a quick glance of understanding, and then Gonzalez, with a very obvious embarrassment of manner, said, "Are you speaking of the young friend who was with you in the casino 3 days ago?" I noticed him. "We have seen him there every day, almost," Paula put in, "until last Tuesday, that is, when he was there with you. He hasn't been since." "Yes, that is the one I mean," I said. "His name is Garthorne, Hugh Garthorne." Gonzalez bent over his plate to hide his face, but the clear eyes of Paula were shining as she watched him, shining, I thought, a little triumphantly, almost as if they were saying, "I told you so." I had but one explanation of their behavior and it repelled me. I imagined that, as so often before I had been deceived in my judgment, they were in fact no more than just two poverty-stricken musicians, eager to entrap the wealthy young man who had by his behavior already proclaimed himself to be this outwardly charming young girl's admirer. Poor Hugh, I reflected, was it for such a tinsel prize as this that he had engaged in that tremendous conflict of wills with his indomitable mother? Yet it was not for me to oppose his desire. The one adversary he had would be quite sufficient. If she could not deter him, it was very certain that I could not. "He would so much like to meet you," I continued, a little later on. "For the moment he is very much occupied." To my surprise Gonzalez shook his head. "Oh. No, no. That would never do," he said. "I don't see, dear, really." "Why not?" Paula remonstrated. "Just once, you know." Had they guessed my suspicion of them, I wondered, and were they now trying to disguise their trap by a piece of shoddy play acting? It looked like that. And Gonzalez's next question confirmed my original inference. "His mother, I suppose, is very rich?" he asked shyly. "I presume so," I said. "A widow?" he mumbled, still without raising his head. "For more than 20 years, I told him. Hugh was, I believe, a posthumous child." Gonzalez raised his eyes then, not to look at me, but to exchange another of those understanding glances with Paula, whose regard of him this time appeared to be no longer triumphant, but tender, consolatory. Then, as if to distract my attention from Gonzalez, she turned to me with one of her pathetic appealing little smiles and said, "Me, too, you see." I did not understand, and in reply to my look of blank astonishment she explained. "I'm an orphan really. My father died a few weeks before I was born and my mother a few weeks after. If Daddy hadn't adopted me I should have died, too, of course." An obvious question suggested itself. "You are married?" I asked Gonzalez. He hesitated a moment and then said, "Yes, but I have not seen my wife for more than 20 years. "And where were you when you adopted Miss Paula?" I inquired. "The Argentine," he replied, "Buenos Aires." Paula's father was an English engineer. He died of yellow fever. A pathetic little history of struggle and self-sacrifice it appeared to me, thinking it all over after I had left them and guessing at much that they had not told me. And reflecting upon it that evening I suffered another reaction, blamed myself for having attributed such grossly mercenary motives to them. Yet I was mightily puzzled to explain otherwise their obvious interest in Hugh, puzzled and presently so piqued that I determined to talk to Gonzales again at the earliest opportunity. It presented itself no later than the next morning, when I found him, by chance, on that other island rock connected to the mainland by a bridge, known as the Rocher de la Vierge. He was at the farthest point where the nose of the spit dips into deep water, but the tide was half out, the sea fairly calm, and there was little danger of being drenched by the spray of a sudden swirl. He greeted me with a shy eagerness, at once glad to see me, I thought, and a little afraid, as if he braced himself to some intimidating task. I would like to ask you rather a queer question, Mr. Edwards," he began immediately, with a nervous rush that made me think of my own futile attack upon Mrs. Garthorne. I tried to put him at his ease. "By all means," I said, smiling. "If I can help you in any way, I shall be delighted. I am, I assure you, greatly interested in your charming adopted daughter." He leaned on the low stone parapet that guards the end of the rock, and stared out across the magnificent breadth of the great Atlantic that even in its sunniest hours hardly conceals the menace of its destructive strength. "It's just this, sir," he murmured. "Can I trust you with a secret?" "Trust you, that's to say, not to mention it to any of the people concerned?" "You can," I returned quietly. "It concerns your young friend, Mr. Hugh Garthorne," he continued with a little catch in his breath. You see, although he must never know it, I'm his father. I may be forgiven for not believing him. His announcement seemed so utterly unlikely. I did not suspect him of any criminal tendency towards blackmail. I merely supposed that his mind was a trifle weak, and that he was probably subject to harmless illusions of this kind. "Really? That's very interesting," I humored him. "And if I could just meet him once without his having any suspicion who I am," he continued, with a deep sigh, still staring out across the sea, "it would be something to remember. I would be very careful." He turned to me with a sudden appeal in his face. "Oh, I would not for anything interfere with his happiness." If this were acting, it was of the very finest quality. Nevertheless, it was not his expression and the tones of his voice that convinced me, but the likeness to Hugh I had unexpectedly seen when the little man had gazed out at some illusory vision across the world, just as his son had gazed from his mother's window 4 days earlier. "Do you know," I said, "I think I can help you to more than that, but couldn't you tell me something of your story first?" A sordid little story enough, it may appear, set out in dull words, but to me it was quick with the breath of life, inspired by my sight of this sensitive little artist and my realization of what his sufferings must have been during the mercifully short year and a half of his married life. For to me there was something heroic in the fact that he had dared the law for the sake of the child that was coming, had committed a terrible indiscretion with the paper of the firm by which he had been employed and had suffered the full penalty of a term of imprisonment. They had been poor in those days, the Garthorne, grindingly poor, but when he came out of prison, it was to find that his wife had become suddenly rich through some inheritance that might have given him, I thought, an excuse for leaving her, though it certainly gave her none for refusing to see him again. Truly she must have been an abominable woman, even when all allowance is made for my immense personal prejudice against her. It is true that she offered him money, but he refused to take it and went off to South America, taking little more than the violin, which, hitherto the solace of his worst hours, was now to become his source of livelihood. How he lived in those years is of no importance. What is of far more interest is that the little visionary should have built up for himself an ideal of the son he had hardly seen. That had been his chief compensation, and one that Paula, as she grew up, had willingly shared. Between them, they had created the picture of the hero that should be Hugh Garthorne, a picture that had grown so vivid and convincing with the years that it had at last drawn them home by way of Spain, earning their living on the road. And at San Sebastian they had found to their infinite relief that the journey they were planning to England might not be necessary. He had seen an English paper published in Paris, giving the list of visitors at Biarritz, and his belief that the Mrs. Garthorne there mentioned was his own wife had been confirmed 3 days after his arrival by a sight of her in the street. She had even glanced at him, but without the least recognition. The years had changed him more than her. So you'll understand," he concluded, "what it would mean to us just to speak to him. And you can trust us never to let him know. God forbid that I should do anything more to spoil his life." He seemed to have never a doubt that Hugh was in very truth the splendid hero of his father's dream. Hugh, the youngster whom I had known, until less than a week ago, as nothing more than an idle, overdressed, game-playing young waster. "Listen," I said, "the best thing that ever happened to Hugh was when he fell in love with your adopted daughter." He gasped as if I had thrown cold water over him. "With Paula?" he ejaculated. But then I saw the threat of flight in his eyes, and knew that he would utterly sacrifice himself and Paula, too, rather than risk the shadow of harm to his ideal. "No, but listen," I interrupted him, and gave him a succinct account of all that I had seen and hoped for in Hugh since our meeting on the rock 4 days earlier, together with a hint of what he had been before that time. Even then he was not to be convinced all at once. He had been so poor all his life, and the possession of money to him loomed so vastly important. Not until I insisted on the necessity of getting Hugh away from his mother did the little man show signs of conviction. It was an argument that seemed to weigh with him, and I left him wondering if it were possible that his wife had been privy to his fraud before he had committed it, and had turned against him afterwards. I believed her capable even of that infamy. When I got in, I sent a messenger from my hotel with a note to Hugh, saying no more than that I wished to see him, and he turned up after dinner, looking, I thought, a trifle weary. "Well, how goes it?" I asked him. "I'm sticking it," he said, "but it's going to be a long job. I wish I could see Paula again." "Did you do what I asked you?" "And Morello, very much more," I said, watching him carefully as I told him Gonzalez's story, something too deliberately, perhaps, and withholding the essential statement until Hugh was on the verge of guessing it for himself. I could trace in him so clearly the two almost incompatible strains he had inherited. But while I admired the evidences of sympathy, understanding, idealism he had inherited from his father, I knew that they would constitute an almost insuperable handicap in the fight he had undertaken with his mother. He might be tempted to see her point of view. She would be absolute. "But, good Lord, I say," he murmured when the truth was out. "What had I better do now?" It was the paternal strain that, at first, made him unwilling to take my advice. Perhaps I was hardly justified in my proposition. That insulting dismissal of me as a person quite unworthy of the least consideration still rankled, and I may be accused of a paltry wish for revenge, more particularly as there seemed to be no real justification for my taking part in the interview I insisted upon between Mrs. Garthorne, her husband and Hugh. My excuse was that I went to support Gonzalez, as I may still call him, and he certainly needed a power of stiffening. But in the end both he and his son consented to my plan, chiefly for Paula's sake. She, dear child that she was, remained in ignorance still of the fact that Hugh had fallen in love with her, but she was all alight with eagerness, not only herself to meet the ideal hero of their dreams, but also at the possibility that her foster father might be forgiven and allowed free communication with his son, a pardonable deception. I do not reproach myself for that. We had to await Mrs. Garthorne in her drawing room. Hugh had given her no warning that she was to meet the supposed father of the girl he was in love with, knowing that she would simply and blankly refuse to see him. But no doubt she suspected some ambush, for she kept us waiting long enough to aggravate almost unendurably our natural nervousness. When she came at last, however, she made a mistake in her pretense of completely overlooking me. That put me on my mettle. "Who is this, Hugh?" were her first words, indicating Gonzalez. She had closed the door behind her, but remained standing before it, dominating the room. "This," I said, "is Mr. Gonzalez. It is not his real name, the adopted father of the charming young lady your son proposes to marry." "And what have you to do with the affair, may I ask, Mr. Edwards?" she inquired, fixing me with her bitter stare. "That would take too long to explain," I said, "more particularly as there is a far more important explanation to be made. Is it really possible, Mrs. Garthorne, that you do not recognize, Mr. Gonzalez?" I underlined the name with a peculiar emphasis. Her stare traveled almost indolently from me to her husband, and rested there with a calm scrutiny. "You see, Helen," he began, and I fancy it was the phrase and the manner that enlightened her rather than her memory of his face. Her self-possession was almost incredible. Her strength lay in the fact that she could be neither shocked nor wounded. She turned to her son, and said without a tremor, "You know that your father has served a sentence of 12 months imprisonment for forgery?" "But, good God, mater, that was more than 20 years ago," Hugh returned indignantly. I was glad to note his warmth. And then, just for a moment, I caught the least flicker of her eyes in the direction of her husband, a glance that held the hint of a question, a doubt. And although I have no other evidence, for Gonzalez has preserved his faithful silence, I would swear that she had been accessory to his fraud and was debating how far she could trust him to reserve that damning fact. Apparently she was satisfied of his trustworthiness, for she continued with the same effect of inviolable calm, "And what do you hope to gain by this most unseemly revival of forgotten scandals, Hugh? Are you trying to blackmail me into consenting to your marriage with this trumpery little violinist, picked up heaven knows where by an ex-convict? You have tried, quite unsuccessfully, to bully me for a week. Is it to be blackmail now? If so, I can assure you that you will find that method equally unavailing." She had neither humor nor imagination. If she had combined intelligence with that colossal resolution of hers, she might have been great. But she was essentially a stupid woman, or she would have known that her one chance with Hugh was to make an appeal to his sympathy, his gratitude. As it was, she stung him into open revolt. "There's no question of blackmail," he said, and there was something very like hate in his eyes as he spoke. "I have done my level best to persuade you, and I hoped this might help. Now, I tell you straight out that I'm going to marry Paula, if she'll have me, with your consent or without it." "And what do you propose to live upon?" she retorted. "Your wife's earnings?" "Great Scott! No," Hugh said. "I'll make a living somehow. And, as Edward says, that'll be jolly well the best thing that could happen to me." She was incapable of understanding that. She sneered. She believed that his education had been too carefully neglected to permit of his earning his own living. And it was on that she counted for her ultimate triumph. "I cannot prevent you," she said. "But look to me for no help, Hugh, until you come back alone." It was her last word. With that she turned and left us, to all appearances as unruffled as fate itself. No doubt she was supremely confident that time would win the battle for her, that after 3, 6 months, a year or two at most, Hugh would return, alone and defeated, to submit himself finally to her intolerable yoke. She could not believe that he would stand the test of poverty. Had she not suffered it herself? And if I can judge by the sight I had of her a few days ago, she still awaits her son's return in perfect confidence. She was driving in the park, massive and imperturbable as ever, not a thread of white in her hair nor an added line on her face. And thinking at that moment of Hugh's joy in his wife and his little son, of the success he was already making for himself, and of how he had, almost miraculously, fulfilled the dreams of those two dear people who had come across the world merely for a sight of their fairy hero, thinking also, perhaps, that I had, after all, secretly accomplished my revenge and that she must know it, I lifted my hat and bowed to her. Her glance traveled past me. She made no movement. But on her lips and in her attitude I read again the signal of her insulting for. Terrible, indomitable woman. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.